Mark, what's happening, my man?
Hey, hello.
Welcome back.
Thanks. How
We
are
got
you,
our first
Chris?
episode. What's that?
How are you, Chris?
I'm hanging in there. I'm hanging there. You know what? I got to tell you, last night I was thinking of you. I was writing. I was writing a Swift class, and I was like thinking, how would Mark approach this? And Mark would like be very specific and deliberate. And so before I even ran the code once, all I was trying to do was get it to build, and just make it like think through every last thing that this class is going to need. And I'm like super proud of it. I don't know, man. I'm just having a lot of fun building code again,
That's
and
awesome.
and making stuff with you, like this
Yeah,
podcast.
that's right. And I spent last night, I was looking at our first episode and noticing all of my
Our
visual and audio, what's the word for
your
speaking?
ticks.
All of our ticks, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to be more self-conscious about that. If you don't know, if you're listening to this podcast as a podcast, you can also see it on YouTube if you want to see our smiling faces. So that's an option too. If you
Pretty
just so
handsome, I
you
must
know
say,
what
too.
we're talking about when I mention the video. That's what
Yeah,
that is.
word. All right. So last week we talked about what does it mean tactically and practically for anybody who's running a Drupal 7 site. I teased, you also teased, that I have a little bit of a hot take coming for this week.
How
The hot
hot?
take,
How hot is this hot take, Chris?
well, it's cooling off, frankly. The more I thought about said hot take, which I'll just cut to the chase, I was feeling really strongly last week that the association should drop support this year. Drupal 7 support should end this year. In talking it through with you, in like writing down my thoughts on this hot take, attempting to turn it into an article for the blog, I realized this is a lot more complicated than that I can find, and it's probably even more complicated for the folks on the inside who have, you know, I guess insider knowledge or knowledge of things that are necessarily not public. So while last week I was like firmly in the camp of the association needs to this year definitely drop support, after more discussion and more thinking on it, I'm not quite sure. So I thought this week, let's try to talk that out and see if we land, like, do we land anywhere that's a little bit more on a solid footing?
Yeah, we might be on different sides of this issue, of different pieces of this issue. So
Yeah.
lead us through it. Let's go.
Well, my initial take was basically the blog post was going to be called "Why Support for Drupal 7 Needs to Be Dropped," and I started moving through this by thinking through all of the different groups of people that are involved with a Drupal 7 project and what does that mean for them. So the audiences that would be affected by this. But I quickly got caught up. I sort of paused on that area and then got really caught up on Drupal's reputation. It's like what's happening to the project in the marketplace, Drupal.org. So the meat of what I started to write was really about, first and foremost, Drupal's reputation. So maybe we start there. That seems
Yeah, and let's set the table too. Maybe someone is coming to this episode without having listened to the other episode or not being super aware of all that's going on. So Drupal 7 is scheduled to reach its end of life in November of this year, 2023.
I believe November 1st, as I just saw it on an issue.
That could sound right to me. That date has been extended multiple times. So to get to 2023, there had been dates set in the past, and all of those had been extended, and that's where we are today. And the shortest version of that means that once that date happens, there will no longer be community support. There will no longer be a security team supporting the effort. No more releases of Drupal 7. And if you want to understand more about that, go back and listen to our first episode. But that's the table setting. That's where we start.
Yeah. Okay, so starting with Drupal's reputation, and of course you and I have a horse in this race. We run an agency called Chromatic, and we do Drupal development, Drupal support. We've been building stuff with Drupal for 16 years. So from our perspective, Drupal's reputation is very important, and I have a theory that Drupal's reputation may be affected by what I might call baggage that is Drupal 7. Drupal 7 was an amazing product back when it was originally released some many years ago. I remember the first time I started a project with Drupal 7, I was just like, hell yes. Like there's so much stuff here that used to be in Contrib that is now in Core. And I was just like, this is awesome. Drupal 7 was a great product. But it's many years old at this point. And I fear that maintaining Drupal 7 and you know, it has flaws, it has a bunch of things that modern Drupal sort of fixes, configuration management being the first one that pops to mind in my mind as somebody who built a lot of Drupal 7 sites. So it has a bunch of technical debt as a product, or it's just not quite as capable as Drupal 9 or 10 are. But beyond that, I think there's confusion and fear around what's going to happen with this. So confusion and fear with regards to are they going to continue supporting Drupal 7 or not? Ultimately, I think that's a bad thing. If there's confusion around the status of any project, it's going to contribute to the overall feeling about that project. So this confusion and fear is namely about Drupal 7, but does that pollute the waters, so to speak, for the project as a whole, for outsiders or even insiders, you know? So I don't know, like maybe riff on that for a minute.
Don't you think that part of the problem is that in that regard is that the end of life date has been extended already?
Yeah.
And
since 2019, I believe.
Right. And extending it further would just muddy those waters more, would increase what you're concerned about. Unless we are planning as a community to support Drupal 7 forever, we need to end this at some point. And I think it's important to understand why we are here. You know, there's a ton of sites still on Drupal 7. Upgrading off of Drupal 7 is a hard upgrade.
Yeah. I think that's probably worth setting the table on too. Like, why, in theory, are there so many Drupal 7 sites still?
Right.
I mean, I have a lot of things I think, but
I think the simplest version of that is that it's a huge upgrade. It takes, for custom code, it's essentially a rewrite. You have to do a migration. The migration tools are great, but it's not the type of upgrade where, like we have now from Drupal 8 to 9 and 9 to 10, which is the other end of the scale. And I think that is part of, we've been fighting an uphill battle there to educate people that lived, even if they did move their site from 7 to 8, to make sure that they understand, like, no, we're not doing upgrades like that anymore, at least not on the current roadmap. Like, these are easy upgrades.
Yeah, you're talking about like Drupal 8 to 9 and Drupal 9 to 10, where
Right.
maybe I'll misspeak, but essentially it's only about code deprecation, right?
Right. So the last version of Drupal 8 compared to the 9.0 version of Drupal 9, there's no functional changes as for new features. There's only removal of deprecated code. So if you're on the latest version of Drupal 8 or now the latest version of Drupal 9 and you move to Drupal 10, that should be a very small surface area update.
Assuming that the code that you've written has stayed abreast of code warnings and deprecations that are occurring.
Yes, if you've kept up to date with those things over time, then when it comes time to actually do the major version upgrade, in theory, it should be relatively painless. As painless as could be, in my opinion. But Drupal 7 to 8, or now 9 or 10, to modern Drupal, as we've started calling it, is a huge upgrade. So there are people that are sitting there saying Drupal 7 works fine for me. Why do I have to invest all this time when I understand how Drupal 7 works? I'm comfortable with how Drupal 7 works. I don't want to upgrade. And I understand that. And I also understand the flip side from the community perspective and saying, like, how long are we willing to put support and effort and money behind this to keep these things going? I think it's a little bit a bit of an oversimplification to think like, well, this is open source software. If there's anybody out there willing to to keep it up to date or to monitor it and manage it, maintain it, why not keep it going? But as we spoke about last episode, there's a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of time, money, and volunteer hours that go towards doing all the things around the project to keep those things going. And I think most people, many people, want to, expend that effort, time, money towards the modern versions of Drupal. So that's why we are where we are, and it hasn't been an easy answer because there are good arguments on both sides and different constituencies about why we should keep Drupal 7 support for as long as we have. And I think those constituencies have won out to date by getting those dates extended. And then those that are like, we need to focus more, and this has been a long time coming.
Yeah. The other thing too that the walk down memory lane there has me thinking about is the upgrade to you talked about the upgrade from Drupal 7 to 8 being sort of monumental, and that being like a lot of different code would have to be written, but you didn't really touch on like how different. And the major differences were that Drupal 7 was largely procedural. Drupal 8 was, we're getting off of the Drupal island and we're going to join modern PHP. We're going to adopt object-oriented programming. We're going to integrate Symfony. We're going to begin using Composer. So these are not just the product itself has changed, but the underlying architecture and the ways to develop modules or just develop things. Like it all changed. Like the whole underlying architecture changed. And the way you would have done something in Drupal 7, for example, create a simple module that, alters a form or creates a form or creates a content type or an entity, that would be completely different in the Drupal 8 world because it was now using Symfony and object-oriented principles and these types of things. Am I right on that?
Yes, absolutely.
So if you were to that point, a Drupalista, a Drupal developer, and you've been writing and learning all of these APIs for like the form API or how to use CCK, these types of things, almost all of those skills now needed a major upgrade. They didn't need to be completely replaced, but you had to think about them completely differently or write your code to do the exact same thing completely differently, right?
Accurate, yes.
So that created a major fork, pun intended, I suppose, in the community. There were people who were very much against, this is a tidal wave for the Drupal community that we have to completely change the way we write software. And then there was the other half of folks who were saying this is the best thing because this is how Drupal will stay relevant and will attract other PHP developers and things like that. It all resulted in the first major and probably the most successful Drupal fork, right, which was Backdrop, correct?
Yes.
Still a project today whose foundations are based in Drupal 7.
Correct, yep.
Okay, and might be a place, if you have a Drupal 7 site, to migrate beyond end of life, correct?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay, that is still to be researched by yours truly.
I mean, we haven't built any Backdrop sites, so that's something that sounds right in theory based on what I know of the project, but I can't speak with the same level of authority that we have on the many Drupal 7 and modern Drupal sites that we've built.
All right, let's bring this back. We've sort of set the table for how did we get here and what was the major change between Drupal 7 and modern Drupal, and we're sort of postulating some of the reasons why there are still so many Drupal 7 sites. And I checked it, the last I checked, it was like 441,000 sites are still reporting to Drupal.org as being on some version of Drupal 7. So there's a ton of them out there. I want to suggest too that I think beyond the fact that a good portion of those organizations might have developers or been built by developers who are very much so in the procedural PHP world, I also believe that Drupal 7 sites came in all sorts of flavors and colors, right? Like a tinkerer or somebody who's just creating their own blog might have chosen Drupal 7, 10 years ago or what have you, whereas today they would probably choose something else. What I'm trying to say is that Drupal, I think, has marched on and become more of a large content management system, like more of a system that's a better fit for enterprise or large systems with teams and editorial flows and hundreds of thousands of pieces of content. It still works for a simpler site, but I would posit that many of those 400,000 are simpler sites that don't need the power of Drupal 10.
I would probably assume that that is true. I would disagree that the reason why these smaller sites are not picking Drupal is because Drupal is too advanced or more complicated. Maybe that's true on an individual level. I'm sure there's many examples of all these different things, but I think we have to look at the broader ecosystem too. And there's so many more options out there now than there were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I know we see that in our work. There are sites where Drupal was absolutely the best fit for 10 years ago. And the only thing that, maybe made sense for certain projects, where now there's many more options, just exponentially more, where it said, well, we could do it this way. You've got a simple site, or you can even build something yourself with tools that were not available. So, but I think you're right that certainly a big constituency of these sites that are still in Drupal 7 is, if you are running a large site that has, maybe you're making money from that site, your organization is making money from that site, or it's bringing a ton of value to an organization, it's a lot easier to set aside dollars to invest in an upgrade to modern Drupal. If you've built a site or a bunch of sites that are, not in the business of making money directly, maybe they're a marketing site, maybe it's a personal site, any number of things, and the site does what it needed to do, it's a lot harder of an argument to say, like, we need to spend a bunch of time or money moving the site to modern Drupal. And also at that point, you're left to consider, well, is Drupal still the best option for this? Maybe it was 10 years ago, but maybe, as I just kind of alluded to, maybe it's not anymore.
Yeah, that's about as good a segue as I could ask for. You mentioned that there are many more projects out there or tools available that would be good fits for sites that were once where Drupal 7 was a really good fit. Now there's a lot more competition out there. And this sort of brings me back to this issue of reputation. If, as I theorize, this state of Drupal 7 is potentially hurting the overall reputation of the project, it could be hurting, the adoption of modern Drupal, because there's this stigma or these feelings of unclear roadmap or just status of the project. Could that be hurting, folks that would ultimately choose, or where modern Drupal would be a good fit, but they ultimately don't choose it because there's this weird vibes around the project and where it's headed or whatever. I don't know if that's true.
Well, I think people have strong opinions, and certainly if we could go back in time, everyone might have a strong opinion about different choices that should have been made. But it's not clear to me what you think right now, given where we are today, given the concerns you're mentioning about the reputation of the community. Well, which is the better option? Which is going to have a better, more net positive impact for those concerns? Is it dropping support for Drupal 7, or is it extending support for Drupal 7? And if it's extending, for how long?
Yeah, like you, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where I land on this. It's a very...
I'm sure.
You're sure? Okay.
I'm sure where I land.
Well, let's keep going. Let's talk out some of the other things. I'm worried too that keeping Drupal 7 support, and I'm not as familiar with the, dare I say, idiosyncrasies of maintaining Drupal 7 in its current state, keeping it secure, essentially. We're not adding new features or things like that. I'm not as privy to exactly what all that entails, how much work that entails for core contributors and contributors, folks who are maintaining these projects. But at some point, it has to be having an impact on how much modern Drupal is progressing, right? And in so keeping up with its competition. And I'm thinking of like Contentful or Adobe Experience Manager or some of the other, I guess you'd say, Drupal competition out there. If for example, we as a community decided we're going to continue supporting Drupal 7 for another year, how much does that, or does it, impact the progress of the Drupal project as a whole? And there are so many ongoing initiatives that are critical to help keep Drupal relevant, attract new talent. I'm thinking of GitLab initiative. I'm thinking of getting Drupal.org off of D7. Drupal.org itself runs on Drupal 7, getting it to modern Drupal. I think the GitLab initiative, as I go back a step, is super important because, like contributing code, this is like a GitHub pull request. Like that's the way modern software development is done in an open source manner. And the patch workflow and all that kind of stuff has I think, hindered Drupal as a project. So I'm worried that another year of support might continue to hinder the progress on things that I think are much more important to the project overall. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think the GitLab acceleration initiative is fantastic, and they're making a ton of progress on migrating features that have resided on Drupal.org and currently reside on Drupal.org to GitLab. Moving issues is a big piece that is underway. Project pages will remain on Drupal.org, but I think
but issues themselves will be in GitLab.
Issues themselves will be in GitLab, just like merge requests are now.
Yeah.
And the reason why that is important generally with regard to Drupal.org and Drupal.org still being on Drupal 7 is that there's a massive amount of code that powers Drupal.org. And as we mentioned before, moving from Drupal 7 to modern Drupal, rewriting all of that code into an object-oriented approach is a huge
And what
effort.
you mean is that a lot of that is bespoke code.
It's bespoke code specifically for Drupal.org. It only runs on that one site.
Yeah.
And the more code that we can remove by not needing to have many thousands of lines of code related to issues and things related to issues, if we can remove that code, that's a win. That's code that we don't have to rewrite into modern Drupal. I think that so that Drupal.org and the Drupal Association, which works on Drupal.org, they're dealing with the same thing that all of those hundreds of thousands of other Drupal 7 site maintainers are dealing with. So it's really useful to understand that context and know that the people that are, some of the people involved with these decisions have a very close-up view of what people remaining on Drupal 7, how they're approaching it. I think as far as, the actual question of should it be extended or not, what I keep coming back to is, which is the least worst option. I think the only thing worse than not extending community support would be extending community support. They both don't sound great, but I think that there is a substantial amount of effort around all of the infrastructure and processes to keep Drupal 7 supported. And I think there's going to be a time and a date where we need to actually, flip the switch, if it's going to be November 1st, 2023, or whether it's going to be a different date. And at this point, for as long as it's gone on, it feels to me that, it's better to just rip the Band-Aid off and do this, because there is going to be pain associated with it, both for the people that are running these sites, which I have a lot of empathy for. We have some ourselves. We're not immune to that. And, and also for the people's reaction to that. There are people that are still on Drupal 7, or even people that still love working with Drupal 7, and they don't want it to end. But that's not going to change, I don't think. So given where we are, I think it has to be done.
I think you've probably convinced me. And of course, selfishly, you mentioned that we have clients who are still running Drupal 7 sites. And we've been saying for literally years, Drupal 7 is end of life. It's going to be this year on this date. And then it gets extended. And we have to go back to the client and say, well, there's good news here. It's been extended. And we end up kind of looking kind of foolish because we've been very seriously pushing for an upgrade or a move to another platform. And then multiple years in a row, we've had to kind of go back to our clients with our tail between our legs and say, actually, that's not true. We've got another year. So I don't think we have any clients who think ill of us or think that we are trying to hold them over the coals or anything like that. But it still isn't a position that, as a business owner who's trying to provide, really good service and honest service to our clients by, via software development, having to change our tune every year is not something that I've, really relished. And I certainly don't want to do it again this year.
I don't want to do it again this year. And, given where we are in the year, we're almost in April. And we're talking about November 1st. So how many months is that? April, May, June. So we've got 7 months between now and the end of life date. There is one line that I think is like tripping everyone up in the end of life announcement. And it mentions that the community, the association, the security team, whoever's making that announcement, they're reserving the right to extend the date before July. So if we get to July, anytime between now and July, there's a chance that they could show up and say, we're going to extend it one more time. So they've left that door open for themselves.
Yeah.
The problem is that is a very short window between July and November 1st. If there are clients out there that are looking at that, people that are running Drupal 7 sites looking at that and saying, I'm going to wait until this interim deadline has passed and then make a decision. Yep. And that leaves a very small window to plan, execute, test, deploy, a full upgrade, a migration, a rewrite of whatever code is needed, all of those things. There are sites out there that would be very tight or impossible to accomplish in that period of time. So keeping that, leaving that door open, I think, in my opinion, is a mistake. I understand. I think that, the people writing those announcements feel the same thing that you just described. They don't want someone to say, well, you made me look like a fool. You told me the end of life was this, and I told people that, and I, tried to be helpful by getting them moving, and now you're extending it, and now I have egg on my face. I look like I was, I'm the boy who cried wolf. And so they've left themselves a little bit of an out, and I understand that, but I think it's a mistake, and I think it, leaves us in an unenviable position now where people are sitting there hoping and assuming that it's going to be extended yet again one more time.
Yeah. I think you've convinced me, and that it does beg the question too, and I tried to do a bit of research prior to recording today. What is the status of the Drupal.org and GitLab migrations, or the initiatives? And even as somebody who's very technical, who has had contrib modules of my own on Drupal.org, I still find it very difficult to figure out what is the status of something. So I don't know what the status is of getting off of Drupal 7 for Drupal.org and getting over, all the parts that are migrating to GitLab. I don't know the status of them. It's very difficult to find a, high-level overview of the status. Now, I could just be missing it, but I'll just say I'm a pretty technical person. I was talking about writing a Swift class at the start of this episode, and I still couldn't find it in the half hour I used to prepare before this episode.
I think the high-level overview is maybe the hard part to stay up to date on at any given time. There's most likely, there should be an issue somewhere. We'll try to find it, put in the show notes, for the GitLab Acceleration Initiative, which covers a lot of those topics, though that is really only a piece. That's almost like a subset of the get Drupal.org onto modern Drupal. It is an important piece of that. And even for the GitLab Acceleration Initiative, there are, is it every other week or every week? There's a meeting in Slack that happens. But even that gets relatively tactical. We're talking about what people are working on at any given moment. So I do know that, for example, from attending some of those meetings, that work is well underway on migrating issues, and I know there's been test migrations done to show Drupal.org issues in GitLab, which is super exciting. But probably the best place to get that bird's eye overview is there's usually a session that's done at DrupalCon. So I don't know if one was done in DrupalCon Europe last fall, but I know there was one in DrupalCon North America in 2022. I'm sure there will be one at Pittsburgh, at DrupalCon Pittsburgh this year in 2023, where the Drupal Association will share where we are at a high level. So we're a little bit in a weird window here where we haven't had one of those in a while, and it's still a number of months until we get one of those. But so you're right to point out that it's hard to keep track of that at the highest level from the outside.
Yeah, I want to be clear too. I'm not saying it's an easy problem to solve or that it's Drupal.org's fault. It's like a number of things. It is just difficult as somebody purely from an I run a business who sells Drupal services standpoint. I want to stay abreast of what's happening. It is difficult, when you're at arm's length. That seems like as good a spot as any to wrap up.
Let's wrap it up.
Let's wrap it up. So we are probably in agreement that D7 end of life support needs to happen this year. We need to drop support for Drupal 7, and it's the least bad of the options. And yeah, I think you've
So you
brought me
thought
back
you
to the
didn't
island.
have a hot take.
My take
Turns
is,
out you do.
It's warm. It's lukewarm. Maybe when I get through the editorial process and write the article, it'll be a lot hotter.
Well, everyone who listened to this then can weigh in and see how spicy Chris's blog post ends up being.
Just know that almost every single one of my blog posts has been edited by Mark Dorson over the last 10 years. So
you're welcome.
All right. See you, brother.
See ya.